This is part 2 of the workbench build video. We're going to pick up from where we left off in part 1 with a fully assembled bench that's got a flat top. In this video, we're going to focus on building the vices, including all the working mechanics. So let's see how that goes. So I'm back with a quick update. Today I'm working on the vices. So those two boards you see there on the workbench are vice chops. So the one on the left is kind of the blank for one of the leg vices, and then the smaller one there will be the end vice that'll go down on the right hand side of the bench. So I've got all those glued up and I've got them trimmed down to size. I've got all the glue joints and stuff cleaned off. And so my next step, especially on the leg vices, is I'm going to put a slight chamfer at the top. So that's what I'm working on now. The crosscut sled I used that I made to help put the angles on the apron, on the boards for the apron where they meet the legs at the dovetail, that crosscut sled is coming in very handy because now it's allowing me to very easily put a 45-degree chamfer on the top. So I'm also going to do the top edge that'll kind of be the very outside edge of the end vise. So that's what I'm working on now, and then once that's done, we'll check back in as we start shaping the leg vices. So I wanted to do a quick update on making the vice chops, and I accidentally created a challenge for myself when I was cutting down and shaping the blanks for the leg vice. So I've got one of them situated and standing upright, and you can kind of see it. It's more or less the shape, kind of two different tapers that I was shooting for. So it came out okay, but the challenge ended up, and like I said, this one's kind of been sorted out. It's in pretty good shape. I've got to fix the other one. So the challenge with this one is I cut this using a handheld jigsaw. And I knew the blade was going to drift. I don't have a bandsaw. I probably should have used a circular saw. And in fact, it's a circular saw that I'll go and kind of trim it up with, and then use the hand planes to get it smoothed out, which is how I fixed the one that's laying down right now. But I don't know if it'll show in the camera, but essentially what happened is the blade drifted quite far. So even though I was trying to cut outside the line and knew I was going to be working back to the line, it really created quite a mess. And if I lay this down, maybe you can kind of see how far off it is, how far it drifted, and just the fact that we've got to fix it. It's really kind of hard. I'll see if I can zoom in. If I zoom in a little bit, you can kind of see how not only rough the edge is, but really the line I'm really shooting for is that straight line kind of to the bottom of the screen. So this is the edge I want for the most part. You can see back here how far off that is. So I've got to trim that down, plane it down, and get it smoothed out. But it's kind of one of those challenges. I've run into a few as I've been building the bench. Part of it is, like with the jigsaw, I use it all the time, especially cutting lines that aren't exactly straight, things like that. But for the most part, I'm working with 1x material. I'm usually not working with material this thick. Those blanks are about 2 1/4 thick. It never really occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to cut all the way through it with the bandsaw blade. It looked like it was going to work. It didn't. Even the circular saw doesn't go all the way through. Trying to freehand cut something like that with 2 different angles on the table saw, maybe I could have done it that way. It didn't seem safe. So it's kind of one of those deals you kind of live and learn as you kind of progress, and you're applying skills you've learned on small projects to big projects. Sometimes you learn additional things. So all right, I'll get these things fixed, and we'll be back making parts, making the screws and handles and all of that stuff soon. So we're finally switching modes, getting down to the final details. So I've moved over to the lathe. I'm getting ready to start creating or making the parts for the vise. So the handles, the screws, all of that kind of fun stuff. So at the lathe, it's relatively simple. These are all relatively straightforward spindle turnings. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. The critical thing is the dimensions. So a lot of the turning I do, you're not always trying to get to really precise dimensions. So I will take my time and just kind of get down to the right size. I think my blanks are all cut up and plenty of size to work down to the sizes I need. So the big screws, the main screws with the handles and all that stuff, will kind of be the most complex turning involved, and I'll come back and shoot that as well. But we'll start here with the handles. So I finally got all the pieces made, primarily at the lathe, to get really just all the hardware for the 3 different vices. So I've got each of the kind of main screw bodies cut out. Everything still needs to be threaded. I haven't threaded anything yet, so that'll be a step coming up. But we're really ready to start assembling all of these different components. So like I said, I've got the main screw body here. I've got the parallel guides, which will also get threaded. We'll show you what the purpose of that here in a little while. And then these larger ones, these 1.5-inch ones, will go on each of the leg vices. So these will be kind of the lower parallel guide. I even got spheres that I turned, so we'll put holes in these and kind of glue those onto the handles. So these will function as knobs, keeper rings to attach the main vise body to the chops. So I think I've got all the pieces and components finally set up, ready to go. I've kind of checked all the sizes. Everything should work. So we'll start working through the final assembly on each of the different vices. Okay, it's time to start cutting thread. So we're going to tap the holes in both of the legs, and then also in the end cap for the end vise. So we're going to start with the legs, the front legs. And before I came over here with the tap, I went ahead and I put a slight chamfer on the outside edge, on the outside lip of each of the holes that we're going to tap. And I also treated the holes with mineral oil just to help lubricate the hole a little bit, where I'm hoping to minimize some tear out. So before I set up the camera, I did do those 2 steps, just a real quick chamfer with the router and some mineral oil. But I've got a 1.5-inch tap, And that's what we're going to use to cut the threads through both legs and the end cap. And I've got a steel tap wrench that'll help kind of grip on here and drive it through. But I will need an extension. So the legs are 4.5 inches thick. And I do want to tap the full thickness. So that should give a lot of teeth and a lot of bite to the vise. And so I do have a socket also kind of ready to go so I can grab onto this end once I get it in. And I can no longer reach with the tap wrench. So let's start cutting some threads. So here's a quick shot of one of the legs with the hole tapped. Hopefully in the camera you can kind of see that. And just kind of shoot down through here and kind of see, kind of goes all the way through. So it's time to start cutting male threads. And I did this trial piece really quickly. It's just a 1-inch dowel that I made. So it's the same size as the parallel guides for the end vise. I wanted to start with these pieces mainly because they're the most simple. If something went awry, they'd be the easiest to replace. But I have the jig set up, and this is the Beal Tool Company jig. It works with a router. I've got a small trim router mounted to it, and you just kind of feed it through. Well, I'll show you in a moment. You just kind of feed it through, but it works relatively well. So I had tapped a nut earlier just to kind of make sure that as I'm cutting, the threads work. So these threads are really exactly what I want. They're a little flat on top, so they're not super sharp. They shouldn't break off. And it goes right on this nut really pretty easily. Once I get it all the way on, it just spins. So that's perfect. Once we get these lubricated, they'll be in good shape. So time to start cutting the parallel guides. I did make this little handle, and I'll pull it off because I'm going to thread this full length. But I will pull off this handle as I'm going through. But the handle just kind of helps guide it along. It just makes it a little easier to turn. You don't have to kind of grip with your wrists quite so much. It is a little easier. So I'm going to use that handle. It's just kind of a shop-made jig. They send you the plans for it. It works pretty simply and easily. But this works really well. It's really simple once you get it set up. So here we go. I'm back with a quick progress update. I've got all the small parts turned to get everything assembled. And so the next step is to drill the holes in the vise chops and really start assembling everything. So I've tried to very carefully map out, mark, measure where the holes are located on both the front leg vices and the end vise. And so what I'm planning to do is to just cut the hole for the primary screw first. Come back, check the fit, and kind of mark where the holes for the parallel guides for all three vices will need to be. I just want to confirm that location, then we'll drill those, tap those holes, glue in the parallel guides, and finish assembling the vise. So those are the steps. We're going to start at the drill press and getting the holes set. So we're moving along. I'm getting the vise chops ready to mount to the bench. The top holes up here on the leg vices, the center hole here on the in vise run all the way through, and they're ready for the primary screw that'll run all the way through and kind of drive the clamping action. Down on the lower portion, I've got holes cut, but these are stop holes. So essentially what I'm going to do is this secondary screw, this parallel guide, is going to mount in here. And this is threaded, so I'm going to thread this hole. But first what I need to do is cut a small recess or a mortise here. So the idea behind that is I've created essentially what's going to be a nut that I still need to tap it. That'll go onto the screw and drop into this little recess. So it'll be flush with the face of the vise. The secondary screw, the parallel guide, is going to drop in here, and that'll keep the vise from racking as we're operating the primary screw, and then this little nut will be able to travel along this screw to add kind of that fulcrum pressure on the leg vise. So the next step really is just kind of, and I've got my router set up with a flush trim setup so I can create this recess or this mortise. We'll be doing the same exact thing on the end vise, so you can see the hole that goes through, and I've also got a nut that'll go here and here. So that's what we're doing next, is just cutting these mortises, these recesses where that nut will essentially drop. We'll kind of tap these holes on all three vices and get those parallel guides put in place. So here's a quick update. I'm getting down to some of the final details on the bench. So the vices, all the vice chops and stuff worked out. However, two of the vice screws that I made had quite a bit of chip out. One of them is down here on the right hand side. You can see if I crank on it, it won't actually tighten enough. It just slips. The one down here that I've got in the in vise has got, I messed up threading that one and knew I needed to fix it or replace or redo it. So since I needed to redo one and I've got one that's not working, the other one down on the left leg works just fine. So I know the vices are going to work. They fit, which is awesome. I'm going to redo those primary screws, and I've got wood glued up to take care of that. And so I'm going to redo those screws, and then we'll be in good shape. As the glue's drying and stuff, I'm just kind of working through some of the final details. I've got the router sitting over there on the table getting ready. I do want to put a chamfer kind of around the top edge, and then I'll also start drilling holes in the bench for bench dogs and stuff. So it's really kind of down to final details. Once those things, the chamfer, dog holes, those kinds of things are set up, I'll kind of give the rest of the bench a good sanding. The top and the aprons have been sanded. They need to, I've been actually just kind of using the bench, so I need to resand. So it's really sort of down to details other than replacing those screws, but we'll get to those things and keep forging ahead. So I'm back at the lathe starting to work on fixing the primary screws that ended up not working out real well for threading. So I thought I'd show you real quick. Here's one of the screws, and then so the problem ends up being this tear out and it's really close to the head. So down here at the end, that's what we want the thread. That's what I want the threads to look like, and it worked pretty well. But as I got close to the body, it was chipping out, and as a result of that, once I got this screw in and the vise chop on and started to clamp it down, it just slipped. So we're going to fix that. I had another screw that I messed up. You can kind of see here in this video, or right there in that shot. I miscut this. So when I cut this originally, the groove was not deep enough and a nut would not go on it. So I tried to redo it, and there were a couple sections here and then also back here where it kind of doubled up. You can kind of see, and obviously this would slip and really not work. So this will go in the hole and tighten up here close to the head. I do have a full thread and it'll tighten up. So that's how I was able yesterday to kind of confirm the chops work and get it all kind of dialed in. But long term, neither of those are going to work. So I decided I'd just redo all three, and that's what I'm working on here is starting that process. So I'm gonna do it a little differently than I did originally. I'm gonna make it in two pieces: the head and the screw body. All of the dowels that I threaded, only dowels, worked really pretty well. There was a little bit of tear out, but very, very minor. So I'm going to learn that lesson. I'm going to make the screws in two pieces, which I think will improve the threading process, and so we'll go from there. So what's chucked up in the lathe right now is just working on cutting dowels for those new screws. So I'm at the lathe cutting heads for the screws. That'll be the main vise screw, and I'm making it in two pieces. So this is the head. We'll bore a hole here for the handle, and also a smaller hole to kind of hold the screw together. These are the dowels, which I've kind of already gotten ready to go, and I've got the screw head hollowed out. It's 1.5 inches, so it's the same size. I'll glue that together and run a pin through this as well once this is all threaded. So this is what it's going to look like more or less, with this portion being threaded, of course. So I'm just kind of working through the other parts as well. So it's relatively simple. We'll take this one as kind of a pretty good model, kind of mark the critical points, and I've got it already, this piece already round, pretty close to the size. I just need to come back through here and get it kind of smoothed out a little more, get it more consistent in size, and then we'll mark it out and finish cutting this piece out. Okay, so we're all smoothed out. I've got the notch cut where the keeper ring will go. And now we're ready to use a Forstner bit to drill out the hole where the screw will mount to. So I've got the lathe slowed way down, and we'll kind of work it in and out, try not to build up too much heat on the drill itself. Okay, so the last step with this piece, I've cleared out some room, some space here with a parting tool. It's just to kind of work this, just kind of round this edge here. And then we'll be ready to part this off and go on to the next one. Okay, so we're ready to start cutting threads on the main screws, and I've got one of them here in my hand. I've got marked with blue tape where I want to stop right here at this edge. I don't want to thread the entire length. That'll leave me a portion up here at the top to glue on the head, and then also kind of a small shoulder that's not threaded that'll be in the vise chop itself. I've run a couple samples through here. I think I've got my depth working. I've changed this setup just a little bit from the way I did the first set of main screws and some of the other pieces. I switched routers to my Porter cable router instead of a trim router. This does seem more stable and more consistent. I've also got a stand back here just to kind of help hold this end while this is still pretty long. So here we go. We'll give this a try, and hopefully it works out a little better than we had first go round. So the main vise screws are done. They turned out pretty well, reshaping them, redoing the threads. This time you can kind of see there's very little tear out. These are ready to go into the bench. I've got the head on, pin driven through it. Everything is glued up, the pin's in there. It's nice and solid. So I'm just going to trim this off with a coping saw, and we'll start assembling the vises. Here's a test fit of the vises. So they're all in pretty good shape. They're tightened up, they're mounted, pretty much ready to go. So the next thing I want to do is just kind of flush the top, get the tops flush with the bench top. I left each of them proud a little bit so I could bring them down so that they're level with the surface. The end vise has the kind of the most work. The leg vises really aren't too bad. So I've got the planes sharpened up, and we'll just start working here on this end and get this level with the rest of the bench. Here I'm boring dog holes into the bench top. As you can see, I've started with putting holes on the end vise. There's 3 of them, one about 2 inches in from each end and one in the center. And I've also put dog holes on the top of both of the leg vises. So at this point, I'm really boring kind of a pattern into the bench, extending all the way from the end vise and then kind of intersecting along the way with the grids for both of the leg vises. So I'm using my battery drill and just a quick speed bore bit, which does a pretty good job. I've got it marked with some tape so I know not to go all the way through the bench, and then I ended up drilling the holes up from the bottom just to prevent tear out on the bottom side of the bench. So I'm working through the final details on getting the vices wrapped up and the bench ready for finish. So the first part is to put this keeper ring in place. And you can see, hopefully you can see, I've got holes drilled and countersunk. And so we can screw the keeper ring onto the vice chop like that. And the way this works is I turn this part of the lathe. So on the back side, I've got what is essentially the outside diameter of this head of the screw, and then on the inside, I've got a secondary diameter which follows this notch, and so that part drops right down in there. We'll screw it on, and then as we unscrew or unwind the vise, it'll pull the vise open. So we need to get that screwed in place. And then the only other thing we need to do is glue the knobs on the handle in place. And then the vices will be ready for operation. So we'll take care of those steps and get the bench ready for finish. So the bench is finally finished. I put 4 coats of tung oil on, so it's just starting to shimmer a little bit in the light, but there's no hard plasticky coating, so the surface is nice and buttery smooth, and there's 4 coats of oil just to kind of help protect it from glue, oil, water, or anything else that ends up getting spilled on top of it in the future. So I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. It ended up being 24 inches deep, just over 6 feet at 72.5 inches wide, and it stands 35 inches off the floor. It was really close to the dimensions that I was aiming for, so I'm really pleased with how it turned out. One of the things I mentioned, I think, in the very beginning, for the core bench top, was that I was shooting for 3 inches thick, and ended up coming out at about 3 1/4. Sort of depending on where you measure it. After I had the dog holes in here, I measured it in several places, and it really came out pretty close to 3 1/4, so I'm really pleased with that. The apron, of course, on the front and back sides is 7 inches tall. And so overall, it really came together and works pretty nicely. I didn't really, when I assembled the vices, I didn't really kind of go through their function and how they're working, so I do want to address that before we wrap it up. But before I do that, I did want to kind of just touch base on one thing that I think would be kind of a very obvious question, which is why put 3 vices on the bench in the first place? So it's a little hard to tell from the camera angle, but I do have an end vise down here on this end, and then there's 2 leg vices on the front of the bench. So why 3 vices? I put a lot of thought into the design and how I wanted the bench to function. So on my old bench, I used two pipe clamps really on the front of it, kind of down here on this right hand end. I used two sets of pipe clamps to make kind of a twin screw vise, and I used dog holes, much like this is set up, to kind of hold things to the top. And that worked out pretty well for me for many years, but as I started getting more into hand tools and wanting to use planes, and I was using scrapers a lot more for finishing instead of sanding and things like that, that bench just racked terribly. But I did like the way that functioned, so I did want to repeat it in this bench. So if you look at the space I'm in, I am down in my basement. The shop works really, really well, but it is sort of I do have some confined spaces. So hopefully down here on this end you can kind of see I do have my lathe, which is pretty stationary. and that's right up against or pretty close to this right hand end. So I knew if I just had an end vise, for example, that it would be challenging to put a board vertically and really work off this end because I'd be right up against the lathe. Likewise, down here on the left-hand side of the bench, you can see this wall. This is part of the basement structure, and I've got this knee wall that really extends out. So as this bench is going to kind of live more or less in this space I'm standing in. A very common design for woodworking workbenches is to have an end vise down here on the right-hand side of the bench, and some kind of front vise on the front on the opposite end on the left. And that works really pretty well for most right-handed woodworkers. And frankly, it would work really well for me. The challenge that I run into though, as I mentioned, working on the end down here up against the lathe motor would be a challenge. Putting a board on edge with this vise down here on the left-hand side, and if I'm planing right into this knee wall, my concern was I felt like I'd probably not really finish that cut very well. And if I'm trying to joint a board or something like that, my concern would be that I'd be applying a lot more pressure at this end of a board and not really finishing strong enough, not wanting to run, smack the plane into the concrete wall. So down here in this space, having that front vise down here on the right-hand side of the bench and working towards the middle of the bench seemed a little more logical, or seemed a little more comfortable. So with comfort in mind, I really wanted a front vise down here on the right-hand side, even though it's really close to the end vise. But once I made the decision to cut my own threads, right, and thread those vise screws instead of buying commercially available ones, then all of a sudden that extra cost, that incremental cost of adding a vise to a bench sort of went away. The other thing I noticed was, I happened to run across a video relatively recently, I think it was Wood by Wright, and he was talking about how he used 2 leg vises on the front of his bench. And after seeing that and thinking about, well, it doesn't really cost me a great deal more if I'm making the screws and I'm threading, kind of making the mechanics for the vises, it sort of allowed me to then very easily, or with not a lot of extra money, add the 3rd vise. And so we'll see how I use it. I'm really excited about it. The great thing is, if I've got a long board, I've got both vices, and I'll be able to tighten, a board between them. And then I've also got these kind of dog holes in between here if I need to hold one end of a board, really from either vise. If it's not quite, about 40 inches, I think, is the distance between those 2 vices. So anything over 40 inches long, I could clamp in both. Anything shorter than that, I've got these that'll kind of function sort of like a dead man, like the sliding dead man would on some other benches. So let's take a close look at the vices and we'll wrap this up. So I backed out the leg vise, and what I really wanted to show you was the function of this lower guide. So the upper guide is kind of obvious. This is the main screw. This is what's applying our clamping pressure. But I've got just a cut off here in my hand, and we'll drop that in here in just a moment and clamp it up. But what I wanted to show you was the reason I threaded this lower parallel guide. So its primary purpose really is to keep the chop from spinning as we're rotating this screw. But its secondary purpose is to help apply fulcrum pressure once we're trying to clamp something up here at the top. So what happens up at the top is, as we're squeezing, when we've got a board up here, as you start getting resistance up here at the top, the bottom wants to kind of continue drifting in, and the vise wants to rack. So traditionally, what you would see on a leg vise like this is a square block of wood, or one way to manage that is use a square block of wood that gets mortised through, and oftentimes it'll have a variety of holes, and you use a peg. And that peg applies fulcrum pressure for the top. This design is set up with a threaded dowel instead of a square board with holes. I've got a threaded dowel, and I've got a nut, and I've got a mortise right here inside the leg vise where this nut kind of recesses back. So if I want to squeeze right up against the leg, I can. I just back the nut right out of the way. But in this case, if I want to clamp this board, and this is relatively wide, but I'll be able to clamp this board up here and use this nut to apply that fulcrum pressure to get a nice tight fit up here at the top. So that's the purpose of this threaded lower guide bar. Now this design is something I picked up out of Wood Magazine. They did a video, a couple different videos on workbench builds, and they had a system on a leg vise that was very similar to this. It was steel hardware, so it was a hardware kit that was manufactured. But once I saw that, and I realized, and I thought, well, you know, if I'm threading this stuff, I can apply the same theory to this, and that's exactly what I did. So this is going to make a little noise. I'm working on friction. I've tried a couple different things to kind of quiet the vise a little bit, but nothing's worked yet. So right now I'm calling this noise character. So that's how that's designed to work. That's the purpose of this lower threaded parallel guide, and what this nut is for. So next we'll take a look at how the end vise is set up, and it's got a very similar design on it as well. So the end vise is designed very similar to the leg vises, and I've got the parallel guides threaded as well on both sides. So one of the challenges with making an end vise that is so wide, so I made this 24 inches, it's the same width as the bench. The advantage of that, of course, is I can use the end vise from the front or back of the bench. It sort of doesn't matter. But with the width, it does want to rack, especially as you're just clamping on one end or the other. If I've got a wide panel that's maybe between one end and the center, it wouldn't rack so much, but most of the time it's going to be shorter boards or narrower boards, and we're going to have that issue with racking. So instead of trying to figure out spacers or other things, using this nut to kind of apply that fulcrum pressure, just like we did on the leg vise, is what we're shooting for. So we still have a little character noise in this vise as well. Get that. So there we go. This is nice and tight, and we'd be able to plane right off of it. And this nut is right up against here, applying that pressure, really forcing all of that extra force down here to the end where I've got my board. Okay, so that wraps up the project and the video. Thanks for tuning in and watching. Hopefully you found something in here that is inspirational and will help you with your workbench build. Feel free to leave any comments or questions in the comments section, and I'll try to get those answered or provide some feedback. Thank you very much again for watching, and we'll catch you next time.